Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. We are really pleased that so many people could join us for this conversation around what the conversation around defunding police is. I'm Jenna Franklin. I'm Oleo's Community Engagement Manager. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we will record this so that we can share it with more people. And so if you have any concern about being recorded, you can also put comments in the chat, but we will be recording it. And with that, I wanted to introduce our speaker today, Angélica Chazaro. Am I saying that correct?
Angélica.
Angélica.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Angélica is a professor, UW law school professor, and also teaches in critical race theory, poverty law, professional responsibility. And Angélica, I'll let you introduce yourself, but we're very, very happy that you're able to join us today for this. And please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for giving me this time and this space to talk to you all today. It's a privilege and I don't take it lightly. As Jenna mentioned, my day job is as a professor at the University of Washington at the School of Law, focusing on critical race theory and immigration law, among other matters. And then outside of that work, I do work with a group called Decriminalize Seattle. And so I've been supporting them for the past few weeks, like years now, in developing and expanding the demands to defund, particularly the Seattle Police Department. And so I was invited to talk about that work with you all here today, and I'm very happy to share some of the thinking that we've been putting together. This is a moment that I know has been very fraught, but really what I'm seeing it as a moment of new possibilities. And I want to start by acknowledging the work that every member of Oleo has done, and that all of the King County staff have done for many years. And also think about the fact that for many years, police reforms, or specifically accountability reforms, have been the best that we could hope for. But we're now in this new moment where people are having a national reckoning, not just here locally, but the national reckoning with the role that police play, particularly in the lives of Black community members. And my sense is that until now, there wasn't enough attention paid to the role that police play and whether that role is in fact the right one. In fact, law enforcement budgets, as you all know, have been growing unchecked, and the budget for SPD and for the King County Sheriff's Office is no exception. And so we've had this sort of unquestioning acquiescence to giant bloated police budgets. But this moment is a different one. It feels like we have an opening to restructure fundamentally the role that police play in our lives, in the lives of our county and city, and actually pull money away from police budgets and towards supporting our communities and defending Black lives. And so as difficult as this reckoning has been, I think it's also just a tremendous opening for city and county officials to rethink policing altogether. Can you move to the next slide, Liz? All right. And so the city of Seattle, I'm going to focus on the demands we've made there, just because that is what I've been working on. But don't worry, we haven't forgotten about the county, so stay tuned. But so far, we have over 250 organizations and nearly 45,000 people, including the ACLU of Washington, One America, Centro de la Raza, and many other organizations signed on to these three demands. So the first is that SPD be defunded by at least 50%. And I think, a few weeks back, that number sort of came as a shock to folks. But again, when you think about how at least SPD's budget has increased 43% in the past 10 years, or 68%, I guess, if you don't take account of inflation, it becomes less shocking to think about, this would just be returning SPD to the size that it was 10 years ago, basically accounting for inflation. When you also think about the ease with which we've disinvested in other public goods like education, or never invested in them at all, in the case of things like universal childcare, again, it can be easier to wrap your mind around that number. And also, at least at the city level, and I know at the county as well, we're used to seeing city and county jobs cut. In fact, Seattle, the state of Seattle has been cutting many of their childcare workers employed through Parks and Rec. They've been seeing layoffs since March, and as recently as last week. But it's not like we see this mass public outcry about the cuts in our childcare workers through Parks and Rec, at least in the city, even though obviously we should. And so when I think about this demand to defund law enforcement, it's really a demand that we have two conversations. The first about the role that police play in our lives and whether that's the right role. And second, what could we be funding with the money we spend on policing to actually support well-being and community safety? And so that's what that first demand is about. And it sort of segs into the second demand, which is to reinvest funds that are cut from law enforcement in real community health and safety. You know, and so for me, when I think about this, when I think about what would it look like to have universal childcare in King County so kids could have a safe and supported place to be while their parents work, I'm sure we would see Child Protective Services reports go way down if that was a reality. What would it look like to invest in housing more so our houseless neighbors could be in safe places and we could stop the violent sweeps of encampments? What would it look like to fund healthcare for all people in King County and Seattle so people could have the physical and mental health support they need, and we wouldn't be relying on law enforcement to provide basically emergency support when folks are experiencing difficulties? What would it look like to make public transit free within the county, you know, so that we don't have a reason to have law enforcement be on our buses and trains in the way that we do now? What would it look like to fully fund programs that already exist, like API Chaya or WABLOC, that are trying to deal with harm without involving the criminal legal system or with minimal criminal legal system involvement? And so that second demand is that invitation, I think, to all of us to imagine what real community health and safety could look like if it was fully funded with some of the funds that currently come from law enforcement or go to law enforcement. So I'll pause there. The third demand is the demand to drop charges against protesters. And this one has felt important to folks because, you know, people have been on the streets and have seen the actions of SPD that I know has been assisted by King County Sheriff during this uprising. And so Seattle, you know, you all have seen the footage. We've received national, even international attention for the extreme violence protesters have faced. And, you know, we believe it's not enough to ban the use of tear gas. You know, we need to actually drop charges against protesters arrested during this time. You people on the streets are sending us a message, and that's the only reason that I'm here presenting to you today, because people have been willing to take action and be on the streets to bring us to this moment. So let's, you know, this demand is about not giving people a criminal record that we all know will follow them for their entire lives because of their participation in this uprising. And so we'll go to the next slide from there, Liz. All right, so here's just some questions that I want to just offer to you all. And again, you know, I don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers because we haven't ever attempted this, you know, and so anyone who comes to you and says, you know, here are the 5 things you need to do and you'll be done, you know, I would caution you to not necessarily believe them. I think what we all do have, though, is many, many years of folks who have been thinking about what it would look like to have a city, a country, a county that is less dependent on policing. And so some of those folks have come up with questions like these. And so these questions come from a document that I linked to there, that Critical Resistance, an organization that's been around for about almost 2 decades now, put out years ago to help people think through what it could look like to move towards a new notion of policing. And so when considering any change in King County, here are some questions I would hope that folks would ask themselves. Does this reduce funding to law enforcement? Does this challenge the notion that police increase safety? Does this you know, proposal reduce the tools and tactics and technology that police have at their disposal? And finally, does this reduce the scale of policing? So just to go through one example, you know, to help folks kind of build this muscle to be thinking through these questions, you know, for example, body cameras, which are often a demand that we've heard, you know, when I think, does this reduce funding to law enforcement? In fact, it doesn't. You know, in Seattle, in fact, when the mayor announced that she would be ordering police to turn on their body cameras for protests, what she was basically announcing was a 2% increase in pay because the collective bargaining agreement with the Seattle Police Officers Guild states in part that any officer who is turning on their body camera will in fact receive a bonus for, you know, basically for going to the trouble of doing that. So in fact, turning on body cameras was an expansion in the Seattle Police Department budget. And that's not even talking about the training for body cameras, buying the equipment, et cetera. You know, does this challenge the notion that police increase safety? when I think about body cameras, I think we're pitched this story that making police accountable or policing done right will make people safe through technology. But police violence, I just don't believe can end through technological advancements. Does this reduce the tools, tactics, and technology that police have at their disposal? Absolutely not. Body cameras provide the police with another tool that can actually increase surveillance and increase police budgets, again, to buy more gadgets. And we know from experience that that kind of technology is actually more likely to be turned against the public than it is to be used against police. That body camera footage can be used to, in fact, prosecute and incarcerate people rather than to hold police accountable. Does this reduce the scale of policing? Again, it doesn't necessarily. They're based on this idea that police who don't use excessive force are less threatening. But we know that police can turn off body cameras, and that when the footage is used, it doesn't often have that impact that community members want, or that that footage is used for surveillance. And so, in the same way that I've just gone through that one example, I think anything that you all are considering in terms of changes, I would encourage you to kind of put through the filter of these kinds of questions to think about what is it actually doing? Is it actually expanding the reach of law enforcement, or is it actually shrinking it? So an example on the other end of this spectrum would be the calls to
I'm going to pause you just for a moment. Somebody in the background needs to mute themselves. Please stay on mute if you're not speaking. Thank you. Pardon me.
Oh, no worries. It sounded like an electric toothbrush, which, I'm all for dental health. So yes to dental health. Another example here would be, defunding police to prioritize spending on community health and education or affordable housing. So would this reduce funding to police? Yes, by definition, if we're defunding law enforcement, we're decreasing funding for policing, and it will decrease its resources. Would it challenge the notion that police increase safety? Yes, because you would be prioritizing funding resources, creating space to imagine, learn about, and invest in the resources that actually create well-being, things like what I've already talked about, universal childcare, healthcare for all, housing for all. Does it reduce tools and tactics and technology? Yes, because if we decrease funding for policing, this will decrease the expansion of their tools and technology at their disposal. And does it reduce the scale of policing? Absolutely, because decreasing the funding for policing decreases the size and the scope and the capacity of systems of policing. And so, these are the kinds of questions that I think the folks at Decriminalize Seattle and elsewhere are trying to keep in mind when we're thinking about what are the changes that this moment has made possible, and how do we walk through the door that this moment has opened without inadvertently expanding the power of policing. And so I'll pause there to go to the next slide. All right. So the risks. So as much as this is a moment of great possibility, I think it's a moment also of great risk. I think one of the concerns is that it'll be very tempting to stick to what we know. More accountability process, more reforms that look like investments in training and equipment. More anti-bias training for police, more body cameras, things like that. But I think that the risk here is that these sorts of concessions won't actually shift policing or protect Black lives. I don't have to tell you all, because you all have been doing this work for so long now, that law enforcement has been dodging accountability for years, often using the very strong law enforcement unions to do that. I suspect that at this point they may jump into accountability efforts now, only because they want to avoid the structural changes that this moment has made possible. And so an example of that my read on the King County Sheriff coming forward and saying, yes, we'd like to be certified by Campaign Zero as meeting the 8 weight reforms, reforms that include things like body cameras. That to me was more public relations than anything else, because in fact, the King County Sheriff's Office already has most of those, if not almost all of them, on paper as practices that the King County Sheriff's Office is supposed to be doing. But that is, you all know that that has not stopped police violence from happening in King County, and it has not made it actually easier for Olio and others to keep King County Sheriff's Office accountable. And so it's just going to be, it's just a huge risk of this moment that police will jump into accountability efforts that you all have been begging them to do for years, because they would rather that than actually shrink their budgets and have us take this moment to step back and imagine that the different kind of policing is possible. The other thing I think we might see happen would be police practices repackaged or reframed without any actual cuts to the police budget. And that's some of what I've already been talking about. The second risk I see at this time is this idea, that we might see some divide and conquer tactics, that like certain nonprofits or others in our community will be offered access or money to county officials in exchange for acquiescence to the watered down concessions. And so if people are said, well, yes, we're going to be doing this new community police partnership that of course the King County Sheriff's Office will fully control, but we'd like to offer your nonprofit money to be part of it. People might say yes, because as we know, budgets are tight and this is a difficult time. And so part of, I think, what we've been trying to do with Defund SPD is get as many people together as possible behind the demands to defund. And I think we've been pretty successful because we know that that temptation will be there, to accept those watered down concessions.
Can we pause for a second and just pose a few questions? Liz, can you reverse one slide and we'll start there?
Did you say go back one slide, Jenna?
Please, that would be great.
Okay, here we go.
All right, so I'm looking at the questions in the
chat.
Yeah.
So in relation, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, so in relationship to this slide for those joining by phone, one of the questions was, should all four factors in terms of reducing funding to law enforcement, challenging the notion that police increase safety, reducing tools, tactics, and technology at the police's disposal, and reducing the scale of policing, do all four of those need to be a yes for it to be considered a valuable move for you?
Thanks, that's a great question. I think that the more of them that are a yes, I think the closer we're getting to actually defunding police and reshaping this idea of community safety. If a tactic didn't meet the first one but met the next three, to me it would still not be a great move, because increasing funding to law enforcement I think is fundamentally against what people are calling for in this moment, which is to shrink the size of law enforcement. The third and the fourth, reducing tools and tactics and reducing the scale of policing, if you're not doing that, then you're probably increasing funding to law enforcement. So in a way, they're also interconnected. There obviously will be different calculuses for each one and for each kind of reform that you all are considering. But I think that using these questions as a guideline will help you see if you're going too far astray from the possibilities of this moment to actually rethink the role of law enforcement and reinvest in the community. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question for you. In relationship to labor union rules, often a reduction could include reducing staff, and many times in the unions, the last hired is the first to go, and they're bumping rights and all of these sorts of things. And that might mean, in the case of policing, that a lot of the gains over the last 10 years with bringing on more diverse staff means that we'll lose that diversity first. Do you have any thoughts about that, or where the cuts specifically should come from?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and one that we're definitely grappling with. And so I don't think there's a way to cut the SPD budget substantially without cutting personnel. So that, I'm just going to say that, I think that would just be a myth. Yes, there are many places in the SPD budget where that money could come from, but really it's limited. I think it's something like 13% of the budget that's not personnel related. And so ultimately what we are talking about is cutting SPD jobs. But there are things like freezing overtime, freezing any new hire, so allowing just for regular folks quitting to reduce the budget. So freezing hires for this year and next year, freezing any purchases of new technology or new equipment, reducing training budgets, things like that could in fact bring down the costs. Other places But ultimately, yes, we are talking about cutting police jobs, and yes, the union contract says last hire, first fired. I guess I want to challenge a little bit, or at least put into question the notion that the younger police officers, well, yes, there's been more training and more diversity. We're also seeing a lot of them being recruited from the military. And so, for example, the person who shot John T. Williams, the native woodcarver, the SPD, was a more recent recruit who also was a probably, I imagine, somewhat traumatized military veteran. And so the idea that, the new generation of police officers are so distinct from their elders, I don't think is necessarily maps onto the reality we're seeing on the ground. I think that also there could be legislative changes or fixes or challenges or even offers to the union to offer some of the older, very highly paid officers some sort of retirement packages to even, invite them to step down. And again, I don't know if that's possible, but we're going to have to face these thorny questions if we're actually talking about defunding and rescaling our police departments.
Great. One more question, then we'll move forward with your presentation. These efforts, how do you tie these specific efforts or asks into reducing police violence rather than specifically a reduction in the size and scale of the force itself?
Yeah, that's an excellent question as well. So my view is that police violence is reduced when there is less policing and communities are more resourced. And so, for example, if we see a trained mental health professional, not unarmed trained mental health professional, rather than a King County Sheriff officer, arrive at the home of someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis, that will already set us up to have less police violence. I understand, though, that this will be a process of scaling down the size and scale of policing, and that meantime, there will continue to be police officers on the street. And so we're going to have to be able to continue to do the very important work that you all are doing around accountability at the same time that we're shrinking down the police forces and resourcing other sectors in the county and the city to actually take over some of that work, and also create the conditions that will allow for police violence to shrink. I think my one concern is if people only focus on reducing police violence through accountability reforms and not through actually shrinking the police force and reinvesting in other places, we're going to continue to see the same challenges that we've been stuck in for the past couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Let's move forward again.
All right, can we move on to the slide that says the process? All right. So at least for Seattle, the city of Seattle, what we're trying to do is keep building that pressure to divest from law enforcement and reinvest in community. And when we win, because we do see the Seattle City Council making concessions or announcing at least that they are planning to cut the police budget substantially, we're trying to have policymakers and lawmakers like yourselves think about the demands driving the budgeting process and not the other way around. As you all know, for so many years, the budget process, I'm sure even to county staff, can be a little bit overwhelming and confusing, and for community even more so. And so we're trying to basically switch that script so that we have a budgeting process that centers Black community specifically, and that is participatory, where people understand where the money's coming from, where people have a say in saying, here are the investments that would actually make us safer, where the communities that have been over-policed and over-surveilled are the ones that are centered in making the decisions about where the reinvestments happen. And all of that is happening through a participatory budget process we're launching in collaboration with a participatory budgeting project, North America's leading organization that does this kind of community-led process. So that's one, is actually empowering community to say, this is what would keep us safe outside of policing, and that's where we want the investments to happen. And secondly, creating some baselines for redistributing the funds. So we're not asking for cuts to overtime that are temporary, so that when the political winds shift, the budget balloons back up to its current size. We want any cuts to be permanent and immediate. We also don't want new funding for policing by another name. And so a lot of folks might experience certain kinds of social work or certain kinds of even like housing authorities as coercive in the ways that they find policing to be coercive. And so really thinking about when we're restructuring our cities and our counties, how are we doing it in a way that people are not going to experience coercive housing, where people, for example, who have prior criminal convictions are not allowed to apply for spots in that place, or coercive mental health, where they feel like they have no choice but to do what the social worker is telling them to do, in the same way that they might experience police as coercive. And then finally, we know that we need investments not just in like community well-being in terms of things like healthcare and childcare, but also towards the programs and practices we want to replace policing. And again, there are people in Seattle and King County who have been doing, I think, heroic work to start developing those. But we need to have sustained investments in them and not expect immediate results. We can't end violence in our communities in one funding cycle. Our police departments have not been able to do it in 150 years. There's no reason to expect community to have it done, within a year of giving them more funding and support. So that's where we're at with the process. I want to end with just these slides that have been making the round. If you can go to the next slide. These are just to sort of start opening people's imagination. You don't realize, but your brake lights aren't working. Imagine that a city, or in this case, a county employee, pulls you over, says, hey, how about I replace those lights for you right here so no one gets hurt? And an hour later, both lights work and you're at home. Couldn't we think of that as public safety? Go to the next slide. Imagining you're experiencing a mental health crisis and you're afraid, you could call 311 and a first responder trained in mental health comes to your door. An hour later, you're in a safe place with your consent and with plans for follow-up care. Couldn't we consider that public safety? Next slide, please. Imagine you're experiencing intimate partner violence and you could text a number where a trauma-informed crisis intervention specialist could meet you in a safe place. An hour later, you're working together to make a plan that will keep you safe for the long term. Wouldn't that be public safety as well? And then the final slide, imagine your friends are intoxicated and fighting, but you don't want to get them in trouble. Imagine you could call 311 and a crisis intervention team could come to your door. An hour later, your friends are sleeping it off at home. Isn't that public safety? And so I know that you all, these are just slides to sort of get you thinking. This is why we want a participatory budgeting process, to help folks imagine the possibilities and invest in them. I want to end with saying that I have tremendous respect for the work that you all have been doing for so long. And I hope that you will accept the invitation from community to rethink and expand the work into defunding and reinvesting in what community considers community safety. Thank you all so much. And I'm excited to hear more of your questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We'll open you up for some questions. One question, have you been in touch with advocates in Minneapolis? And sorry, oh, my chat box just moved. In Minneapolis, which, and what made you, wait, sorry. Have you been in touch with advocates in Minneapolis, which made a commitment to think? Deborah, can you, I can't quite figure out the question.
Sorry, Minneapolis made a commitment to, sorry, I obviously am illiterate this morning, but Minneapolis made a commitment to rethinking and with similarities. And I was wondering if you've teamed up or been in touch with folks on the ground there.
Yeah, we've been very lucky to be in touch with their organization, Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective, who were behind the community push to do this. And so they actually have, at least in terms of comparing them to the city of Seattle, I haven't looked at the King County charter as closely, but the city of Seattle, their charter in Minneapolis has to have a change made to it to even reimagine their police department. The city of Seattle charter doesn't have that challenge. And so they're facing a different set of challenges. Right now, they have two processes going simultaneously, a city process where the city has until the end of July to basically come up with a plan to reimagine the entire Minneapolis Police Department, and then an independent community process that these folks are leading to basically get that kind of input that they want the city to use in their process. And so, yes, we're very much in touch with them and with folks in other cities as well to see what it is that they're moving and what are the different challenges in each place. And I'm happy to put any of you in touch with them as well, because they're doing tremendous work, and I think we're all sort of sharing ideas about what could work and what hasn't been working.
Thank you.
We have a question from Carolyn. How do you see this work relating to gun control overall?
Just overall, is there like a specific example that you're thinking of?
Carolyn, do you want to elaborate?
Got to push the right buttons. Yes.
Yeah.
So I was thinking you would, Angélica, know more about this than I do, but I don't know what the per capita rates of police are, across the globe, let's say. And that it would seem to me that in areas where gun control was enforced, such as the UK, you would need, and since in so many of these cases where the murder occurs, the police officer is claiming a fear for their life in some way, or a fear that a weapon is there, a gun or something. And if in fact we removed that fear, and I realize that people will still be afraid of illegal guns and that sort of thing, but I'm just curious, is there a relationship between those countries that restrict access to guns and a more of a peace officer approach to those that do not restrict access to guns and have more of a military approach, if that is in fact even a thing or not?
No, that's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I don't know the exact statistics on this. I do know that there are countries where, they mostly have the PX officers, and every other country outside the US tends to have less guns. Like we went on that front. And so I definitely think there's a correlation there. And I would also say that, for example, with the recent shootings that we've been seeing at CHOP or Chaz in Capitol Hill, we've heard the Seattle police basically having this narrative of like, we needed to be there so that this wouldn't happen. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that the gun violence that we're seeing in our community, police mostly show up once it's already happened. At best, sometimes they interrupt it. At worst, as you're talking about, sometimes they contribute to it. So the police themselves end up being violent because they say they feared for their lives. And so it's not like what we currently have has actually been working for us. And the studies I have seen in terms of lowering gun violence in cities haven't so much been about like taking folks' guns away, although, I personally am all for that, but more about interrupting violence. And so in Chicago and in other places, there have been these programs, that are under the umbrella of like violence interruption, where community members, not the Chicago Police Department, who has no trust among folks, are basically investing very heavily in the few folks that they've identified who are actually responsible for most of the gun violence. And you see, in one neighborhood, it was like gun violence immediately went down 40% because there were people who were trusted by community who were investing in the folks who were part of the gun violence through the violence interruption models. And so those are the kinds of models I think that we could be seeing investment in here without, getting into the question of whether police should be armed at all. I think that the question is like, are armed police doing anything to reduce gun violence in our communities? And I'd argue that the answer right now is not really, and many times they're the ones who are contributing to it as well.
Great. We have a question from Chandler. Chandler, do you want to pose yourself, since I've been doing a moderate job of interpreting questions?
Yeah, no, I can try to chime in a little bit, Jenna. So I was just curious because I'm not as sure with how police forces pay for or compensate the plaintiff on excessive force cases. And taxpayers are paying for these compensations to the plaintiff. And so just thinking about if there's been any discussion of really coming after the police in terms of those excessive force cases, whether that money comes out of their salaries on a monthly basis, like a union fees or something like that, and are penalized for more and more, depending on the jurisdiction, they're penalized for more and more excessive cases. But just thinking about the monetary value, a lot of these police officers who have been instilled this racist undertone throughout their life, not much is going to change unless there's something that really hits them or unless they're really fired. So I was just curious if that has been discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are different efforts on that front. One, is this idea of like withholding pensions and not rehiring cops involved in excessive force. And that, I think, meets all the questions. It reduces police funding. It challenges the notion that police increase safety, reduces the scale of policing. So that's one front where police pensions and just the ability to be rehired is tied to excessive force. A second front I've seen this in is requiring police to be personally liable for misconduct settlements, because again, the idea that money for misconduct settlements should be coming out of the county's already limited dollars, it's, is pretty outrageous. One place we're talking about SPD cuts for the city isn't just, the police, the extra weapons and overtime, but also the millions of dollars that the police currently pays outside counsel to even just defend against these police misconduct lawsuits. And so you making officers personally liable, I think, for misconduct settlements and for even paying for their own defense, ultimately, really, I think would shift some of what we're seeing in terms of police accountability, perhaps.
Another question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to invest in people who are causing violence in our community?
Yeah, I mean, it's very funny. I think the folks who are sort of detractors of that approach have called it like the hug a gang member approach, but it really is about thinking about who are the folks in our community who are causing violence in terms of membership in gangs, and saying, well, what would be the alternative to this? Why is it that you are involved in gangs to begin with? What kind of programming would we need to have so that people would see a different way out for them? What type of, literal, money and resources invested into somebody's individual training? Like, what is it your dream that you'd like to be doing if you weren't involved in gang violence? And how can we support you in doing that instead? I think in the cities that have taken this seriously, again, because folks are interrupting the violence based on their personal relationships with folks, and then also offering actual resources and investments in place of that, they've seen police and gun violence go down. And I'm happy, I can put it in the chat box, or actually I don't know if I can pull it up right now, but there's a couple of reports that have just come out from a place called the Justice Collaborative that go into detail about what these programs are like, that I'm happy to share with you all.
That's a perfect segue into the next question, which is on the topic of research. Would you be able to or willing to send along a collection of publicly available research studies that address the conversation we've been having today?
Absolutely, yes, that's all I do.
Yes, and you can send them to me or Liz, and we'll share them with the whole group.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I'm happy to continue to be a resource. These are, again, like very thorny questions. I think it's been hard because folks are saying, well, can we replicate what another city's done? But no one has actually yet done this. And so, for me, I feel like I'm like, all right, we're taking this leap because we're actually being asked to do something fundamentally different. And so there are specific models in specific places, for example, Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon is a mental health program where currently you call 911 and the dispatcher decides whether to send the call to police or to mental health, unarmed mental health professionals who are community-based. And Cahoots has the option, the mental health professionals, to call in law enforcement if they really feel they need it. But in 99% of the cases, they don't. And the only times that they have, they say will be things like a person was running into traffic and we can't physically grab them, but maybe a law enforcement official can. Even in cases like that, of course, I think where we have to be careful is not replicating the patterns that we see elsewhere that don't work. So for example, with Cahoots, one thing I hear from them is that it's hard because 911 is still run by law enforcement. And so the law enforcement dispatch is still the one making the decision about whether to bring in the community-based organization. And so we'd want to see a version of Cahoots here, for example, that is fully civilianized because 911 would be fully civilianized and the civilian would be deciding whether to pull in law enforcement or the community-based agency. So there are, small examples across the country, but no one has yet done what we want. Which is why, we have this great opportunity now.
I'll add a little context to the next question, but recently Olio's Community Advisory Committee transmitted a letter stating they're providing their advisory advice on body-worn cameras as a tool for the King County Sheriff's Office, and declined to take an official position either way, but instead outlined a series of policy questions, conversation points that they felt needed to be publicly discussed, and approached providing their advice in that way. And in part because they did months and months of research and determined that, it's not a panacea. There's not it's not the kind of tool that everyone on one side or the other thinks it is. And so they were opting more for advocating for full and transparent conversation, and also elected to provide advice that they wanted non-law enforcement related tools and investments to be considered in equal measure. So we would like to know a little bit more about where body cams fit into your analysis, and also what kinds of public conversations you think need to be had so that the community can really understand that type of investment. And we have people on all sides of the issues, directly and indirectly impacted, and they often don't have the same, opinion about what they want.
Sure, that's a tricky one, and I so appreciate the work that those folks did in presenting, that research, and I would be fully behind this idea of investing in non-law enforcement type responses, because I think that's where this moment is headed. I think for me, the conversation around body cams has been, I think about it in the time before this uprising and like now, because then I think the time before this uprising, it was offered as like one of the only things that was available to us. This idea that like we could put a camera on an officer and that would reduce the dangers of violent policing. I think this moment is an invitation to say, well, the reason we're even putting body cams on officers is because we're asking them to do a job that they're not equipped to do. And we want to have accountability for like after they're violent, or hope that like having the body cam on will make them think twice before being violent. This moment is asking us, well, why should they even be the ones who are in that situation, where investments in other places and having non-armed responders, you wouldn't need to put a body cam on a social worker who's unarmed, and so like that to me is really the question in this moment. And ultimately, at least from the studies I've seen, and these sorts of tools it's very hard, as you all know, to have the police be held accountable. And it's very easy for the footage to be used against the folks who are making the complaint to begin with. It's just, if I had seen a police force truly held accountable through body cams or any other means, and like willingly jump into accountability efforts and not use the police unions as a way to shield them from real accountability, then I think I would have more hope that body cams play an important part. But at this point, I see it more as like, sure, until we fully defund police, some folks might think they have a place. I personally don't, but it's interrupting the conversation that I think actually has to happen in this moment, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. We have a question and then we're told to ignore it, but I think there's still value in asking, at least in part. Do you have any sense of where shifting policies, practices, training, the direction of training within current police departments, or potentially in future departments of public safety, are going, or are they going in a direction that allows them to exist with this idea of defunding? So is there anything happening today, or that you think is integral in the future related to those priorities and practices that align with the concept?
Within law enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a tricky question, because it feels like, we have now like generations of police reform efforts that frankly have failed, to keep Black communities safe. I was just looking at an article in Crosscut that Sean Scott wrote about the history of policing in Seattle, that shows that like, back in 1955 there was recommendations made because of over policing and violent policing of Black community members in the Central District, that the police department should engage in like cultural competency training. It's like, this is not new. This is literally almost 70 years old, these kinds of recommendations. And so to me, it feels a little bit like we're spinning our wheels if we're, still clinging to the idea of training. Like ultimately we have limited resources and time to put attention towards these issues. And I think that putting as much county resources towards asking community what they think makes them safe and reinvesting in those programs that produce real community safety without policing, to me, is a better expenditure of like the time and efforts of county and city officials than trying to come up with the one magical training that will finally be the thing that makes the change that we so desperately all want to see.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Graciela. Graciela, I'm going to let you ask your question, but it relates to the intersection of defunding and questions around immigration and immigration reform. Are you able?
Yeah. Yes. Hi. Hi, Jenna. Hi, Professor Chazaro. Thank you so much for
Graciela, can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sorry. I had my headphones. I wanted to thank you, Jenna, and Olio for putting this, as well as Professor Chazaro for spending time with us this morning. Thank you for the presentation. So yeah, my question is, so this is more about the intersection the intersection of what crimmigration is, or like the intersections between immigration enforcement and police violence, or the criminalizing of immigrant communities, which are Black communities too, and brown communities. So I just wanted to know, under this model, and this is just kind of like picking your brain, just kind of see what your thoughts are, since you're a subject matter expert. But yes, what does immigration enforcement look like under a defunding law enforcement model? I know this is more about federal government, is not so much local, but is it really like, is it abolishing immigration customs enforcement, or ICE, or defunding Customs Border Patrol, CBP? Just, I'd like to know your thoughts, and because, there's a lot of violence on immigrant communities, and a lot of criminalizing, and a lot of racism and discrimination. So I would just like to know how the immigrant community can also be part of this solution of reimagining what safety looks like, and public safety.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Graciela. And yes, you've hit me where I also live, which is on my immigration law and reform side. So when I think about this work, and another hat I wear when I'm not at UW or with Decriminalize Seattle is as a member of Resistencia, which is a community group that's been focusing on now for years, trying to shut down the immigration detention facility that's in Tacoma, Washington. Now, that facility until recently was half filled with folks who were like from Washington state and other states that are nearby, and half from asylum seekers brought up from the border. At this point, there are few asylum seekers brought up from the border because the president has closed the border to asylum seekers. And so most of the folks who are currently detained in Tacoma and who are facing deportation are folks who have ended up there. And many of those have ended up there because of some contact with law enforcement, having some sort of criminalization on their record, from anything from like a DUI up through much more serious offenses. And so to me, I've invested so deeply in this defunding of police, because I know that for immigrant communities, that any contact with law enforcement, even if it doesn't end up with a prosecution, like the simple fact of an arrest sets you up for having an application for immigration relief down the line, like DACA, like hopefully any sort of comprehensive reform that ever passes. It sets you up to have that denied, because immigration authorities look very, very carefully at any sort of past police contact somebody has on their record as a reason to say no to allowing them to stay in this country. So that's one front, like decreasing the number of ways that people might come into contact with law enforcement for immigrant communities will mean that more immigrant community members will have the chance that, like US citizens have, to like make mistakes and get beyond them, and not have that mistake mean that you might be permanently banished and deported from your community. The other piece of that, I think, is that contact with law enforcement, again, even if King County is no longer handing people directly over to ICE from the King County jail, ICE officers still show up outside the King County jail, or look at the jail rosters and go find people in their homes. And so we know that being arrested and ending up in King County jail, again, whether or not you're convicted, is still a way that people are being picked up and being sent to the Tacoma Detention Center. And so again, if we had less reasons for people to end up in the King County jail, if our communities were resourced to deal with problems in a way that created less crime, or that created less reasons for people to be arrested, then we would see fewer people end up in immigration detention and facing deportation. And so, I think that's the intersection I'm seeing here. Of course, I'm also involved in efforts thinking about what it might look like to abolish ICE, to not think about immigration enforcement through a police lens, which is basically what's happened in this country over the past 3 decades, that the rise of sort of the war on crime and the war on drugs made the immigration system also be one that looked at immigrants solely through the lens of as potential criminals or criminals, and so, Donald Trump's rhetoric about immigrants as criminals isn't new. It's something that we've been seeing built up here since the 1980s. And so, to me, those fights to sort of decriminalize immigration and basically like decriminalize the city of Seattle and King County are intricately connected.
Thank you so much. Your response gave me a lot of joy. Thank you, thank you. I've been involved in those, you know, in like open, well, courts open to all, the courtside arrests, and you're right, any immigrant contact with law enforcement. It's honestly really traumatic. It's traumatic experiences, having gone through one myself. So not thinking through immigration through a policing lens. Thank you so much for, like, you know, informing us and for your response. Thank you.
Of course, Graciela.
We're coming into the close of our conversation, and maybe we have one question that we can briefly end on and then sort of give our thanks. And I think you touched on it a bit, but do you see a relationship, or is there a specific interest in creating a relationship between defunding police and defunding jails?
Absolutely, yes. I will end on that. So I think our efforts to defund the Sheriff's Office, to defund Seattle Police would be incomplete if we're not also looking at basically defunding the prosecution and removing parts of the municipal code and the criminal code that are criminalizing basically acts of poverty. And so, you know, at least within the city of Seattle, we're combing through the Seattle Municipal Code to basically look through the ways in which people are being arrested for things that, if they had the right resources, would not be a crime. And so I think that defunding the police and also looking very carefully at how we're using our resources to arrest and prosecute people who need other types of help mean shrinking the jails. Like, I want to see the population of the King County Jail, of the youth jail, continue to go down. And I think that we will see that, and we can see, you know, less of a need for the King County Jail if we're seeing both less law enforcement and less reasons for people to be arrested to begin with by the law enforcement that's left.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Professor Angélica Chazaro from the University of Washington. And I think community activist is an okay thing to say?
Sure.
Or pro-community member.
I'll own it, yeah.
We appreciate you joining us and sharing all this information. As you know, many of the people on the call today are really thinking about important public policy issues. We're thinking about budget. We're thinking about all these things. So we appreciate you making yourself available to us and illuminating us. And also, we encourage folks to stay connected with you as they make decisions in their work. If they have questions, we know that you're interested in keeping the conversation going. And to everyone on the phone, I will put our guest speaker's profile link in the chat. So please do stay in touch. We're happy to facilitate any questions and answers, but you may reach out and connect directly too. So we thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.